So welcome back, everyone. It's been a very long week for all of us, or at least for me. So I'm especially appreciative that you took the time to be here today. One disclaimer first, there's a lot of construction going on in my neighborhood, so there's going to be a little bit more background noise than there usually is. I hope it's not too disruptive. So today we're going to be spending most of the class discussing different topics related to Jews and theater. I'll mostly focus here on Yiddish theater and Broadway musicals and different moments in the histories of these two art forms. Where thinking about Jews and popular culture together illuminates interesting aspects of both. But before we move on to that discussion, several of you asked me in the chat last week to say a bit about Jewish life and Jewish culture in Philly specifically and give a little bit more texture to our discussion of Philly culture and Judaism. So I'll spend a couple of minutes focusing on that before moving on to the main topic of the day. So there have been Jews in Philadelphia since the colonial era, and several prominent Philadelphia Jews played really crucial roles in the creation of American Jewish institutions and American Jewish culture. So I'll just mention a handful here. So this is Rebecca Gratz. She's one key example. She was a pioneer of Jewish education and philanthropy in the 19th century. She was instrumental to founding orphanages and benevolent societies, as well as the first Jewish Sunday schools, which were modeled on the rise of Christian Sunday schools in the early 19th century. There was a rumor that she was the inspiration for the character of Rebecca in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, though that's never been proven for certain. There are sources that show us that she was at least a fan of the novel and appreciated the positive depiction of Jewish female piety within the novel. But even if it's not true, her life shows how it shows some sense how one member of the Philadelphia Jewish community influenced American and Jewish culture, or at least was seen as influencing American and broader culture. In the 19th century, Philadelphia was also a central site of Jewish religious reform of various kinds, and experimentations in how to make Jewish life and practice conform to surrounding trends in America. So we spent a lot of time discussing New York as a site of the development of especially Yiddish newspapers in the late 19th century, as well as American mass consumption newspapers. But there were Jewish newspapers in America in English before there were Yiddish newspapers, and one of the earliest and most prominent of these was the Occident, which was founded in Philadelphia. So it was created by a rabbi named Isaac Lear, who wanted to use the publication to create a sense of community for Jews living throughout the country, especially as people began migrating away from big cities on the East Coast throughout the country. Lear was a proponent of traditional Judaism and opposed reforms happening in Jewish practice at this time. But the fact that he used a monthly newspaper to spread this message of traditionalism suggests the ways that even traditional Jewish practice took advantage of ideas and technologies in the American ether and incorporated them into their understanding of how to bolster traditional Judaism. So this publication included a mix of sermons and literature and included pieces sent in from around the country. So these are only two examples, but they give a sense of Philadelphia as an early site of American Jewish cultural creativity. In an essay on Philadelphia Jews and their contributions to American Jewish culture, historian Jonathan Sarna highlighted a few key characteristics that define the cultural contributions of Philadelphia Jews in the early to mid 19th century. So first, many of them believed that culture should be educational. Second, they believed it should produce a sense of unity among Jews throughout the country. Third, it should be dignified in its presentation, so as to not court criticism. And fourth, that it should be intensely patriotic and pro-America. So there are many important differences between these early forms of American Jewish experience and culture in Philly, and later ones that we've been discussing together, like Yiddish newspapers or radio. But there are also important overlaps, and those later newspapers and later radio technologies also attempted to fuse education and entertainment, and fuse a sense of Jewish unity and a sense of American patriotism. So far I've been discussing Jewish life in Philadelphia up until around the mid-19th century, but for most of this course so far, we've been focusing on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this was a time that saw the advent of various forms of mass culture in America, as well as a large influx of Jewish immigrants to the United States, especially from Eastern Europe. So now I want to turn to a short discussion of what Jewish life was like in Philadelphia at that time. So Philadelphia was like many other major American cities in that its reputation as an industrial hub led it to attract new immigrants during a period of mass migration. It never had as high a foreign-born population as some other major cities like New York, but by 1910, about a quarter of the city's population was foreign-born, which is still pretty significant. As was true in New York, in their first years in Philadelphia, many of these new immigrants clustered in neighborhoods not only with others migrating from the same region, but with other immigrant groups as well. So for Eastern European Jewish immigrants, this area was Southeast Philly, in parts of what is now Society Hill and Queen Village. So I have a map here. It's not a great map, but it gives like some sense of what's going on. Basically around Spruce Street to Christian Street and around 2nd Street to 6th Street, with South Street being the main major center of commerce at that time for Jews. So the Jewish quarter of the turn of the 20th century was actually only a few blocks away from where the Cat Center is now, which is kind of interesting, though of course the Cat Center was not there then. This area became an area of major immigrant settlement because it had cheap housing. It was also pretty close to the ports where new immigrants came in originally. And it's also where many of them worked in sweatshops. So it was close to their work and a cheap place to live. There were over 200,000 Jews in Philadelphia by 1915, a remarkable jump from around 12,000 in 1880, showing how much the period of mass migration transformed Jewish life in Philadelphia. As we have discussed in other areas like the Lower East Side, the fact that this area of the city was called the Jewish Quarter does not mean that we should see it as one community and one united sense of identity happening in this area. Instead, there were many internal variations on what it meant to be Jewish in this area based on regional identity, religious practice, cultural affiliation, politics, and many other factors. And just like those other areas, though this area was pretty heavily Jewish for around 40 years or so, there was a lot of out-migration during that period as well. So new immigrants were replacing those moving out, making it seem like this area housed a consistent population when the actual people there were actually different over time. Over time, Jewish settlement migrated to other areas of the city, including South Philly, West Philly, and the suburbs. So Jews in this area took part in various cultural forms, including some of those that we've been discussing so far, and that we'll be continuing to discuss today. So the Forward, for example, had a Philadelphia edition starting in 1901 that included advertisements and supplementary material meant to cater specifically to the needs of Philly's Jewish community. They also had similar ones in Chicago and I think Boston, to other major hubs of Jewish life. So there was an office in Philadelphia for the Forward that had at various times about 40 writers on the staff. And at one time, this office was across from Independence Hall on 5th Street, a block over from where the National Museum of American Jewish History is now. But there were also many local Jewish institutions, including newspapers like Die Jiddische Welt and the Jewish Exponent, literary societies, theaters, bathhouses, and radio stations that were created and consumed primarily or exclusively by a local population. There were Yiddish theaters in the Jewish Quarter, for example, where traveling troops would perform. So this is an image on your screen right now of one theater where Yiddish plays were performed, the Garrick Theater. So to conclude our brief discussion of Jewish life and culture in Philadelphia, and as a segue into our next topic, Jews in theater, I want to show you a short excerpt from an oral history collected by the Yiddish Book Center on Jewish life in Philadelphia. In it, Alan Katz, who grew up in West Philly, discusses his experiences growing up listening to Yiddish radio and attending Yiddish theater. So I'm going to play the clip for you. It's about 2 minutes long. Then I'm curious to hear your thoughts and reactions. So I'll play the clip now.
Ayelet, I'm not hearing that. Are other people having the same problem?
Oh, really?
Yeah, the audio is not coming through.
Oh, that's a shame.
Do you want to check? Let's see. Is the volume turned up within the frame there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's playing very loudly for me, so.
Strange. Oh, maybe trying without your headphones.
Without my headphones.
If you want to try it.
All right, let's see. Let me know if this works.
But our world revolved around the radio. And of course, when my Bubba was alive, that revolved around 1400 auf a radio dial, 1400 on your radio dial, the Yiddish station in Philadelphia, the only one we had. And two interesting stories there. One is a newscaster by the name of Nathan Fleischer, It was sponsored by Hi-Hat, Peanut Oil, Hi-Hat, Peanut Oil. I never forgot the song. But as far as Fleischer was the Gabriel Heater of the Yiddish radio. He reported every day about the war in Europe. As far as he was concerned, there was no war in the Pacific, and it was generally the Russians are advancing on the Russian front. That we always knew. And we just the other thing was kind of interesting. My Bubba would listen to, and of course I sat in the radio and listened to, were the soap operas, the Yiddish soap operas. Choros Balaiden. Oh my God. You know, it turns out many, many years later, my wife and I became real theater nuts, and particularly living downtown Philadelphia after a while. We got to a lot of theaters, and I got to see a lot of Irish plays. And I came to the conclusion that these Irish playwrights had copied specifically from the Yiddish soap operas. The difference was, in the Yiddish soap opera, the husband was out of work. The daughter was going with a non-Jew, and the son had tuberculosis. That was the Yiddish problem. The Irish, the husband was drunk, the daughter was pregnant, and the son was a no-goodnik. But basically, the same story. It was just the way things were.
So I want to hear your reaction. So what strikes you about his description? How might it connect to topics we've discussed over the past 3 weeks so far? And as always, please type your responses into the chat, and Anne has graciously agreed to read them out to us.
Just waiting for people to collect their thoughts. Sure. One of the big things was sitting with his bubby was the biggest recollection.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we touched upon last week, the idea of where you're listening to culture being really important to how you're experiencing it and how you remember it. So this was Yiddish radio he was talking about, but if people were listening to mass consumption radio next to their bubby as well, does that change how they're understanding their relationship to mass culture? So it's really interesting how central his listening experience is to how he remembers it. Yeah.
So we'll wait and see if anyone else has a comment. I mean, one of the things that's so striking to me is that he noted the parallel with Irish theater and assumed that it was the Jewish soap operas that had come first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's how he experienced it. I think that's really interesting. That's something I'm going to be picking up on in a minute. But yeah, I think that was one of the things that I was really drawn to here too. That like that's how he understood the flow of cultural transformation here. And it's possible that that's true. And it's also possible that it was flowing the other way. It's also possible that both of them were sort of picking up on just certain general tropes of soap operas in this period.
Right, maybe it was an American immigrant trope or something like that. So people are commenting on just the existence of Yiddish radio shows and in as late as the time when he was a boy. One says, I have an image of Yiddish culture of traditional and not modern, but the existence of Yiddish radio through the 20th century challenges that preconception.
Yes, very much so. So he was dating it based on his description of the war to around World War II, which was really the height of Yiddish radio, the 30s and 40s. But Yiddish radio station, or like programs with Yiddish radio, not full Yiddish radio stations, continued up until the 21st century. There are still a couple of programs now. Which is remarkable. So thinking about Yiddish radio really changes our perception of Yiddish in America, definitely.
Yeah, and then another comment, which it looks like it was sent just directly to me by accident, is that mass culture, like jingles, really have the power to embed and persist with really strong memories of association.
Yeah, especially the music. Something about that really triggers people's memories. The fact that he was able to sort of call it up so intensely says something about how our memories work, definitely.
Yeah. I think that is it for now.
Okay, great. So I wanted to show you this video both because it gives us a firsthand account of how Jewish culture in Philadelphia functioned, on the ground and how it's experienced by consumers. But I also wanted to show it to you because it does a great job encapsulating the themes and questions I want to highlight in today's lecture on theater. I'm especially interested in what this video can tell us about hybridity and fusion, which Anne and I were just talking about. So how different cultural forms played into each other, in this case, radio and theater. So he's talking about radio and theater's influence on each other. But also how Jewish and non-Jewish art forms drew on similar themes, but also often borrowed plot points, dialogue, songs, or actors from other linguistic or cultural contexts. And also how different visions of Jewish culture and American culture coexisted in these spaces, sometimes in tension with one another and sometimes bolstering one another. So I'll start with a history of Yiddish theater in America before moving on to Jewish interaction with other theatrical spaces as producers, subjects, and a little bit as consumers. So first, a bit of background. Like newspapers, Yiddish theater was a pretty new art form when it took hold in the United States. There were several antecedents, including amateur skits on Jewish holidays like Purim spiels, and didactic plays by adherents of the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah. But scholars really date the beginning of professional modern Yiddish theater to mid-1870s Romania, when future impresario Avram Goldfaden organized the first professional Yiddish theater troupe. This troupe traveled throughout Europe and eventually the United States and quickly achieved mass popularity. But his plays were dismissed by some critics as overly melodramatic, but they also encompassed characteristics that would come to define New York's Yiddish theater as well. So plots that vacillated between reflecting contemporary Jewish concerns and European and American cultural influences. Many were a mix between melodrama, ideology, musical, and comedy. And importantly, from the beginning, these plays drew in a broad audience encompassing sweatshop workers and intellectuals. So this image on your screen right now, it's from Yivo, and it's a Romanian and Yiddish flyer from 1903 from a play by Goldfaden called Horban Beis Hamikdash, or The Destruction of the Temple. And that's a sketch of Goldfaden right at the center. The first Yiddish play to be performed in the United States was an operetta by Goldfaden. It premiered in New York in the summer of 1882. So quickly, theater became one of the most important American Jewish cultural institutions, and Yiddish theater in the United States began influencing Yiddish theater in Europe as well. So by 1918, there were 20 Yiddish theaters on the Lower East Side, housing approximately 1,000 performances each year, with audiences exceeding 2 million spectators. Most major areas of Jewish settlement had local Yiddish theater scenes, like Philly, we saw before, comprising a mix of professional and amateur productions and traveling productions. But New York was really the major hub of the art form. So this is the Grand Theater, and you can see Jacob Adler's play is being performed here in the Broken Hearts. And this is the inside of one of the Yiddish theaters on 2nd, which is now Village East Cinema, which is one of my favorite movie theaters. So the first Yiddish productions rented out spaces on the Bowery on the Lower East Side that had once housed performances by and for German and Irish immigrants. Again, this reflects the polyglot, multi-ethnic. Am I unmuted? Okay, I don't know what happened there. So I'll just backtrack a little to make sure everyone heard me. The first Yiddish productions rented out space on the Bowery on the Lower East Side that had once housed performances by and for German and Irish immigrants. So this reflects the polyglot, multi-ethnic nature of this neighborhood. By the 1910s, so here's a map of this area that you've seen before. By the 1910s, the center of Yiddish theater shifted upward to 2nd Avenue, which became known as the Yiddish Rialto or Yiddish Broadway. Yiddish theaters relied on an audience of new immigrants from Eastern Europe, which looked at theater both as an escape and as a way to process their transition to America, as many of the plots centered on themes of acculturation and tension. But Yiddish theater audiences also included a significant number of non-Yiddish speakers, including other immigrant groups who were also living in this area, as well as native-born Americans who were drawn in by the acting, the music, and the interactive relationship between actors and audience. So journalists and writers like Hutchins Hapgood, Norman Hapgood, and others wrote glowing reviews of Yiddish productions in English language newspapers. And journalist Lincoln Steffens praised Yiddish theater in his autobiography as, quote, about the best in New York at the time in both stuff and acting, end quote. So this image on your screen right now is by artist Jacob Epstein, and it's from Hutchins Hapgood's 1902 book, The Spirit of the Ghetto, which took readers inside the life of Jewish culture on the Lower East Side. The Hapgoods were both colleagues of Kahan during his time on the Commercial Advertiser, so that's how they knew about the Lower East Side, and he was really crucial to getting them access to these various institutions. So this image focuses on the audiences who were raptly watching the production. We don't know what play they were watching. And you're seeing them from the balcony, looking down at the play. In the text itself, Hapgood also spent a significant amount of time focusing on Yiddish theater and describing the audience of Yiddish theater in New York and its relationship to other venues in this area. So here's a representative example from this text, and I'm going to read it out loud to you, and then I'm curious to hear your responses. In the 3 Yiddish theaters on the Bowery is expressed the world of the ghetto, the New York City of Russian Jews, large, complex, with a full life and civilization. In the midst of the frivolous Bowery, devoted to tinsel variety shows, dive music halls, fake museums, trivial amusement booths of all sorts, cheap lodging houses, 10-cent shops, and Irish-American tough saloons, the theaters of the chosen people alone present the serious as well as the trivial understandings of an entire community. Into these 3 buildings crowd the Jews of all of the ghetto classes, the sweatshop woman with her baby, the day laborer, the small Hester Street shopkeeper, the Russian Jewish anarchist and socialist, the ghetto rabbi and scholar, the poet, the journalist. The poor and ignorant are in the great majority, but the learned, the intellectual, and the progressive are also represented. So what strikes you about this description? What questions does it raise for you? Again, type your responses into the chat.
While we wait for responses specifically to this, we just have someone Richard pointing out in the chat that some of the Yiddish theaters on the Lower East Side were later resurrected by Jewish owners like Bill Graham as rock icons like the Fillmore, like in the 1960s.
Yes, or as movie theaters is another thing that they became. Yeah. Yeah, the history of these spaces and how they change over time is really, really interesting.
Okay, so Elias writes, underpinning this is a great anxiety about how the working classes spend their leisure time, and also a desire to legitimize some of those leisure activities like theater going in comparison to other less desirable ones.
Yes, there's definitely a hierarchy of culture being created. There's highbrow and lowbrow, but also within lowbrow, a sense that there are good cultural forms and bad cultural forms. And that's a big thing that was going on at this time. And a big set of debates within Yiddish theater was, what does it mean to be Yiddish theater and what is appropriate in terms of highbrow and lowbrow culture? And these debates were sort of roiling at this time.
So Jonathan notes that it seems like everyone was living in a kind of town together, really close together and knowing each other, aware of each other, unlike today.
That's an interesting point, yeah. So it's talking about internal diversity within the community, but also the ways in which they're all existing within the same space and they have a shared sort of cultural understanding because of that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Any other responses?
Yes. Related to that, I think it's a related point. Miriam points out that the complexity of the potential audience is really striking. That for one show, you could have all of these different kinds of people.
Yeah, and think about all of these different audiences, where they're coming from early on in their days, what else they're reading or watching at this time, and how that might influence how they're watching the play. The fact that some of them might not be watching it understanding the dialogue. So Hutchins Hapgood is not understanding Yiddish when he's going to this play. So thinking about all of the different viewing audiences that Yiddish theater producers have to cater to at the same time is really interesting to think about.
Do you think that there were many people who attended who didn't understand Yiddish?
There are accounts of it. So it was a common phenomenon. I would not say that the majority of audiences were, but there were definitely people like Hutchins Hapgood were there, as were Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants. And I think it's also telling that a lot of his description is about the audience. So he might be watching the audience as opposed to watching the play.
Especially if he's not understanding the play.
Exactly.
So Seth is asking if there was any differentiation in Yiddish theater between immigrants from different places.
That's a good question. I haven't seen a lot of discussion of that. I would assume there were lots of theater troupes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I would imagine a lot of those are based on regional lines, and maybe some of the plots emphasize that over others. But I think one of the things I've seen come up again and again in the scholarship on Yiddish theater is how heterogeneous the audience is. So I would imagine it's people from all of these different backgrounds in the same space.
Right. So another point that speaks to that too comes from Richard, saying that Jewish culture seemed to be a more powerful point of convergence in terms of Jewish diversity than, for example, synagogues would have been, where people
that's interesting.
Splitting themselves off into groups.
Yeah, and then sort of picking up on that, I want you to be thinking as I continue lecturing about what makes this space Jewish, if anything. Is it the Yiddish? Is it the plots? What if the plot is not about Jewish culture? And I think one of the things that I want to highlight is the fact that it's up for debate, what makes these spaces Jewish, and it would have been different for these different audience members. Continuing on, one of the things I want to suggest with this quote is the diversity of Yiddish theater and how it reflected the heterogeneous nature of its audience. So many early plays were musical melodramas with formulaic plots and songs, sort of like that oral history we heard before. But over time, Yiddish theater grew to encompass dramas, operettas, vaudeville, comedies, and avant-garde modernist theater. Works by Ibsen, Chekhov, and Shakespeare were performed in translation or adapted to conform to the perceived taste of the Yiddish viewing public. So there's a common legend from this period in Yiddish theater and Yiddish literature that many of these translations of Shakespeare and other figures carried the subtitle Verteidigt verbessert, which means translated and improved. This is now seen as apocryphal, as most of these playbills don't actually include this designation, but it's still worth retelling because of the symbolic power behind it. So why has this legend been so long-lasting and so resonant is a question to think about. So it's meant to evoke humor from an assumption that there's a huge chasm between the high cultural art of Shakespeare and the lowbrow nature of Yiddish theater. It's also often used to imply a lower level of education or cultural literacy by the audiences of Yiddish theater. So in order to make high culture like Shakespeare understandable to the Yiddish masses, it needed to be translated and adapted significantly. This, to me, is a complete misreading of the cultural power of Shakespeare on the one hand and of Yiddish theater on the other. So Shakespeare's plays were always meant to be accessible to a broad audience with various levels of education. So some came for the bawdy humor, and some came for the political implications of his texts. And the audience of Yiddish theater was similarly diverse in terms of intellectual level, taste, and engagement with non-Yiddish culture. But these legends also highlight the ways in which Yiddish theater did draw from various surrounding art forms, and as we'll see later, various surrounding art forms also drew on Yiddish theater. So unlike plays translated from English or other languages, other playwrights used current events to inspire their plots. One of the most successful Yiddish playwrights was Jacob Gordon, or Yankov Gordon, and he achieved a lot of renown for the realism of his plays. And he was really known for dramatizing the tensions inherent in the immigrant experience. And this variety on the Yiddish stage, the fact that there were things like King Lear and things like this, led to a vibrant field of Yiddish theater criticism. The fact that much of this criticism was published in the Yiddish and English press highlights the intertwined nature between all of these various cultural institutions. Critics argued back and forth over the merits and the drawbacks of Schund, which is lowbrow theatrical productions, and realism. But for audiences, the diversity meant that they had a wide array of options to choose from. The Yiddish theater scene was dominated by troupes led by powerful impresarios such as Boris Tomaszewski and Jacob Adler, who managed, directed, and starred in their own productions. This, for example, is an image from Jacob Adler's funeral in the 1920s, which drew a crowd of about 50,000 mourners on the Lower East Side, showing his avid fan base and cultural import. Many of these troupes were often family affairs. So Boris's wife, Bessie, and Adler's wives and children, including Dina, Sarah, Luther, Celia, and Stella, became stars in their own rights. Several actresses achieved renown on the Yiddish stage, including Molly Picon, Bertha Kalish, and Ida Kaminska. And there's a small handful of female actor managers who ran their own companies. But like the Yiddish press, the Yiddish stage remained a mainly male-dominated space, with male actor managers exuding most of the control and benefiting the most financially. So the heyday of Yiddish theater lasted from around the 1880s to the 1920s, and its overwhelming influence began to decline during the Great Depression, though Yiddish theater is still performed in New York today and in some other areas of the United States. But the reverberations of Yiddish theater continued long after its peak. Several stars became crossover successes in other venues. A good example of that is Stella Adler, who is Jacob Adler's daughter. She achieved great renown as an acting teacher for stars like Marlon Brando, Robert De Niro, and others. She was also a central force in New York's group theater, which produced many influential plays throughout the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, especially 30s and 40s, including those by Jewish playwrights like Clifford Odets. And Yiddish theater was a major source of inspiration and talent for the Borscht Belt, vaudeville, and variety shows of the early to mid 20th century. In addition, works by Yiddish playwrights have been performed in translation since the early 20th century. And the obscenity case surrounding the translation of Sholem Asch's God of Vengeance was the inspiration for Paula Vogel's recent Broadway play Indecent. And it was also simultaneously revived in Yiddish by New Yiddish Rep, which is one of two troupes, along with the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne, which still regularly performs Yiddish theater in New York in the 21st century. So as we've seen, while Yiddish theater was an art form primarily for and by Jews, it was never an exclusively Jewish space in terms of the audience or in terms of the content performed on the stage. But Jews were also heavily involved in other areas of American theater in the early and mid 20th century. So from political plays like Arthur Miller's The Crucible or Mark Blitzstein's The Cradle Will Rock to more popular fare like vaudeville. Jewish cultural producers were heavily involved, for example, in the creation of a new art form beginning to take hold in the early to mid 20th century, which is musical theater. While there are antecedents like operetta or even Yiddish theater in earlier periods, musical theater as we know it today, with songs woven into plots meant to drive the plot forward, really began to take shape in the 1930s and 1940s. And many of the most influential songwriters associated with this genre were of Jewish descent. So George and Ira Gershwin, Oscar Hammerstein, Richard Rodgers, Harold Arland, Irving Berlin. This was also a time when the lines between musical theater and popular music were very blurry. So many of these composers also composed the hit songs of the era and were mainstays of Tin Pan Alley, the area of the city where much of the popular music was being produced and published. So there are several different reasons that people cite for the overrepresentative nature of Jews as cultural creators on Broadway and in musical theater. One is the fact that this was a really new phenomenon taking hold in America, meaning, unlike other art forms, that this was less established than opera or classical music, though at the time the lines between these different art forms was more blurry than it is today. It also meant that there was more room for newcomers to break in, and like other areas of the entertainment industry, this was a way for Jews and other immigrant groups to advance financially when professions like law or medicine weren't always welcoming to them. Others view it as a way for new immigrants to assert an identity as Americans by taking part in the formation of a new American art form in the early 20th century, or conversely, as a way to infuse some sense of Jewishness into American cultural forms and therefore American culture. So one good example of that is Irving Berlin, whose God Bless America has become woven into people's understanding of the United States and to American patriotism. Another common reason is the debt owed by musical theater to Yiddish theater and vaudeville. There was a lot of overlap in plots, but also in actors, playwrights, theater owners, and producers. Some of the most prominent musical theater songwriters had roots in these genres as well. So one good example of this is Oscar Hammerstein, whose father, William, was a theater manager, and his grandfather, also Oscar, was a very prominent producer of German theater and vaudeville. Others highlight the musical connections between jazz and blues on the one hand, and Ashkenazi Jewish liturgical music on the other, both of which take advantage of minor scales. This meant that there were cultural traditions that some Jews could draw upon that had resonance with what was going on in American popular culture at this time. We'll be discussing this idea further next week and complicating it a little bit when we discuss the jazz singer and Jewish involvement in early Hollywood, but I'm just posing it as an idea right now and we'll return to it next week. Another interesting reason draws on something we discussed a few weeks ago, the ways in which many Jewish immigrants used consumption as an avenue of acculturation into American society. For many Jewish immigrants, buying a piano and giving your children piano lessons was seen as a key marker of integration into American society. This is what afforded writers like the Gershwins the skills that allowed them to take part in creating these musicals. It's also important to keep in mind that the Jewish identity of these people meant something different to each of them. Some of them saw their Jewishness as central to their art or identity, and some of them didn't. And this obviously changed over time and based on different contexts. So instead of giving an overview of the history of Jews and musical theater in general, for the rest of the lecture, I want to zero in on one musical, West Side Story, and the various things that it can tell us about Jews and musical theater. I'll be drawing here a lot on Warren Hoffman's excellent work on West Side Story, some of which was the assigned reading for today for those who read it. For those of you who haven't seen it before, I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis. West Side Story is an updated version of Romeo and Juliet. You can sort of think of it as a different Farteitstube and Fartbessert than Yiddish theater, where the action has been transplanted to New York and updated to the 1950s. In this setting, it becomes a story of a feud between two rival gangs. One is mostly made of children of immigrants, coded in this period as white. So Tony, the Romeo stand-in, is identified as of Polish descent. The others aren't specified. And the other gang is made up of recent immigrants from Puerto Rico. Over the course of the musical, the tensions between these two groups vying for control of their neighborhood simmer to a boiling point, leading to violence and the destruction of the lives of the two protagonists, who were Tony and Maria, who are the Romeo and Juliet of the piece. It was originally produced on Broadway in 1957 and has been revived on several occasions, including a production that was partly in Spanish in 2009. The translations there were done by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who would go on to write Hamilton. And there's a new, dark, pretty stripped down revival that was about to open in 2020 on Broadway when Broadway shut down due to COVID-19. That was actually the last play that I saw on Broadway while it was still in previews back in February. So there are several ways to read West Side Story as a Jewish text. First of all, the creative team was made up of American Jews. The lyrics were by Stephen Sondheim, who was very young at the time, but would go on to become one of the major voices of American musical theater. The music was by Leonard Bernstein. Arthur Lawrence wrote the book, and Jerome Robbins directed and choreographed the original production. So it was a piece of American culture written and produced by Jews. In addition, Warren Hoffman points out in the article that some of you read for today that the original idea for the musical was actually to update Romeo and Juliet to be about life on the Lower East Side. Jerome Robbins came up with the idea in the 1940s and started workshopping it with Bernstein and others. And the idea was to set it in the Lower East Side and have it be centered around a Jewish family and a Catholic family celebrating Easter and Passover. Shakespeare's plot would then become an avenue through which to explore the ethnic tensions between different immigrant groups on the Lower East Side. So there are two reasons why the creators seem to have decided to switch the plot away from being about Jews. First, the writer of the book for the musical, Arthur Lawrence, was worried it made the musical too closely resemble the plot of similar stories like A.B.'s Irish Rose and other famous works of theater and early film that highlighted similar tensions using romantic plots. So they thought it would be derivative. The other reason is that by the time the musical was being produced in the late 1950s, other ethnic tensions were becoming more prominent in New York with the rise of immigration from areas like Puerto Rico. So the creators hoped changing the plot to focus more on contemporary immigration would make it seem more relevant to audiences. It also, to some extent, seemed out of step with the anxieties of American Jewish life in the post-war period, where Jews were moving to the suburbs and trying to fit in, and Jewishness was often being expressed in religious rather than ethnic terms. So underneath West Side Story are interesting questions about what it means to be a Jewish musical. So while the plot of the musical changed since its original inception, other scholars have focused on the ways in which you can still see the roots of the original plot or the original idea for West Side Story, which was then called East Side Story, within West Side Story as it took shape. A prime example of this is towards the beginning of the show, where there's a dance prologue where the audience is introduced to the rival gangs. The music for this prologue begins with a tune that for many people heavily resembles the sounds of a shofar during high holiday services. So I'm going to play you both. I'm going to undo my headphones again. So let's start with the shofar, listen to the sounds that it's making, and then I'll play you a little of the prologue.
Tekiah, Shavarim, Teruah, Tekiah Gedola,
Okay, so now let's play West Side Story. So this is not necessarily something that all audience would pick up on. And I've heard different stories about whether this was or wasn't intended by the creators. But at the very least, it gives us a sense of different ways of reading Jewishness into West Side Story, the ways in which audiences might experience it as Jewish if they understand certain things about Jewish culture or about the backstory of the musical. So there are plenty of examples that I could give to illuminate the complex relationship of various aspects of Jewishness and various forms of theater in America and what they reveal about art, American identity, and Jewish identity. But even in this small taste that I gave you today, I wanted to convey a sense of the complexity of this topic and what a focus on the hybridity of cultural creation in Yiddish and English can tell us about Jews and American popular culture. So now I'll shift to Q&A, if there are any.
That is totally fascinating. So we have some questions that people had posted earlier, so maybe I'll ask them a way of sort of jumping back, and then if people have more questions that are coming up, they can put them in now. Sure. Richard asked earlier, there were performances of Shakespeare outside of the Lower East Side in English as part of day-to-day life that such that like Yiddish theater was copying things that were happening elsewhere. Was it mirroring and just like making it accessible to Yiddish speakers, or was it doing its own thing?
I would imagine it's both. Yeah. Okay. Shakespeare was definitely being performed at this time, and often in bowdlerized versions that weren't necessarily the exact same plot as Shakespeare's plays. So there was sort of a cultural tradition in many cultures of changing Shakespeare that was going on at this time.
And to today. Mm-hmm. I mean, Shakespeare has that kind of status, right?
Right.
Okay, so Jonathan noted that he had read recently that so-called race records like blues and similar popular music and also old-time country music had a heyday before the Great Depression. And then in the 20s, there wasn't enough money in their audiences to pay for like not super mainstream music. And so that's more of a comment, but is that something that you're also seeing in Jewish and Yiddish mass culture?
That's a good question. I'll talk about that a little bit more next time because it's an interesting topic to discuss in terms of how people appropriate or pay homage to other cultures, because a lot of what we think of as early Jewish involvement in American popular culture is taking advantage of African-American art forms like ragtime and jazz. So I'll talk about that more next week because it's very relevant to The Jazz Singer, which is the first talking movie.
Excellent. Okay, well, so we'll come back to that. So there's a question here about the New Deal, which is sort of related and the interaction with the economy, right? So writes that he learned that Carl Reiner was a factory worker until he got to start acting in a New Deal sponsored acting class in the Bronx. And so how did the cultural projects of the New Deal interact with Yiddish theater?
Oh, that's a great question. So a good example of that was Cradle Will Rock, which I showed before. It's mostly American Jewish theater as opposed to Yiddish specifically, but there were various federal works projects that artists could take advantage of during the New Deal. And they were kind of complicated in the sense that they were supposed to be about cultural creation, but the politics of the artists didn't always line up neatly with the politics of the government. So this was a very radical production. It was about union organization. And so it was shut down by the WPA. And they had to sort of produce it on the fly in a different space. There's a great movie about it from 1999, also called Cradle Will Rock. And so, yeah, the New Deal is definitely central to the formation of a lot of these cultural forms.
So much that I want to go learn more about now.
Yeah, this was just meant to give you a taste, an overview. There's so much more to talk about all of these things.
Yeah,
I'll send out a list of references again if anyone's interested.
Perfect. Okay, so Larry Silver is asking if you could say a bit more about Tin Pan Alley. He says, I realized that the boundaries were fluid. Gershwin wrote for every level, but just how much did Jews shape and dominate that aspect of popular music?
They were one of the central forces in it. So Gershwin and Irving Berlin and several others. And again, it's about this cultural hybridity because these are often Jews who are taking on traditionally African-American forms of art, including ragtime and jazz. And together, this fusion is what becomes so popular. And that is a complicated thing that we'll be discussing in more detail next week.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. So there's a couple of questions that I'll ask at once that that have to do with gay Jewish culture. So the first is at least 3 of the 4 Jews mentioned with the West Side Story were also gay or bisexual.
All of them are, yes.
All of them? Okay. And so a number of contemporary queer theorists have connected that to homoerotic bonding among the Sharks and the Jets. So that's one half. And then the other question is, was the widespread early acceptance in general theater of people who identified as gay or lesbian, was that mirrored in early Yiddish theater?
That is a great question that I do not know the answer to. That would be a great thing to find out. I'm not sure. I would guess that the best person to read about that, and I'll send out a link to this, is Warren Hoffman, who's done a great series of works, both about Broadway and about queer Jewish culture, both in Yiddish and in English.
Yeah, he would be the go-to on that. So I sort of squished those 2 questions together. Was there something else that you wanted to say about the West Side Story?
Was there a question there, or was that just
a comment?
The answer is yes, definitely. I think it's a fascinating element of the play that you can either read into the play itself or just think about the dynamics of theater at that time. But it's definitely there.
Okay. So Billy and Barry, or Billy or Barry, I don't know which one of you typed this in, pointed out that famously the It Ain't Necessarily So of the Gershwins mirrored a Jewish melody as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's supposed to be the same tune as when you're about to learn the Torah, the brachas before the Torah. It's the same tune, and it's a song about making fun of the Bible. So it's an interesting sort of fusion between different interactions with traditional culture.
Fantastic.
Yeah, totally fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Now I'm going to go re-listen to that song like as soon as I think that the questions may have slowed down. And if that's the case, I'll just stall for 1 second in case somebody else has a burning comment or question that they want to make, and just say that it's fine to let everybody go back to their constant refreshing of various news web pages for the rest of the day, and look forward to next week's lecture and to seeing you all again. It's actually wonderful to have this sort of constant and this little break, a way of stepping into a world that is removed from the one we're living in right now for a little while.
So one disclaimer before the next lecture. So in the assigned reading, which is obviously not necessary to do, there's a great text called Entertaining America that might give you a little extra context to understand what's going on. I'll be focusing in a lot of the lecture on the jazz singer, the one from the 1920s. Don't watch the later one with Neil Diamond for many reasons. But we couldn't find a way to make it freely available to you. It's available on Amazon Prime for a small fee. And if not, I'll try to give as much context as possible so that people who can't actually watch it can still understand what's going on.
Awesome. Okay, so there's some discussion in the chat about current election coverage in Yiddish, which I'll leave for the chat. But there's one final question, which is a question about what it cost to attend Yiddish theater versus regular general theater.
I know that both were relatively cheap for the lowbrow forms of theater, like vaudeville or Yiddish theater, and which means that it could be a pretty mass audience in terms of its makeup.
Excellent. Okay, I think that is a great place to sign off for today. Thank you so much, Ayelet, and thank you so much to everyone for being here.
All right, thank you all for coming. See you next week.
Bye.